Hi, 7th and 8th grade. We are continuing on with chapter 23 in American Land I Love. We're on number 78 in our notes, so go ahead and turn to that, and we're going to get started. Okay, we are going to talk about Saddam Hussein. He was a dictator in Iraq. He had ousted the previous ruler and almost immediately went to war against his neighbor, Iran. Even though both nations had a strong religious background in Iran, it was actually being run by a religious leader. And in Iraq, the dictator was religious. The two of them fought against each other, even though they were the same religion, but they were two different branches of that same religion. And that was one of the reasons they fought. But then what we're going to talk about now, as long as Iraq and Iran were fighting against each other, the United States did not really get involved with that. Most of the world just let those two fight it out. That was up between them. But when he invaded the tiny oil-rich country of Kuwait, which you can see at in the map, Iraq is in orange, and then Kuwait is directly to the southeast almost. It's like right on the south, right bordering the Persian Gulf. He wanted to take that oil-rich country, first because of its oil wells, but also because of its location. It was on the Persian Gulf. Now you can see from the map of Iraq, they have a very small section of coastline. So Kuwait would offer a much larger section of coastline. The reason that's so important is because they need that coastline in order to ship oil out to around the world. And so Iraq wanted that extra space so they could continue to ship oil. Now, when he invaded that tiny kingdom, he used the excuse that Kuwait was part of OPEC and yet was selling oil for less to some nations than it was supposed to, because OPEC is a monopoly and it sets the price for how much a barrel of oil is actually worth. And they accused Kuwait of selling it for less than that, kind of an under the table dealing. There's really no evidence that Kuwait really did that. But they were, this is the other thing that really stuck in everybody's craw in the Middle East. Kuwait was allied with the United States, as is Saudi Arabia. So Iraq attacking Kuwait and saying, well, you know, we can do this because they broke our monopoly agreement, so we have the right to invade. And the United States said, no, a business deal gone bad is not a good excuse to invade another country. And so Saddam Hussein invaded that tiny country and basically started to take it over. But one of the weird things he did, because, you know, he's all about, you know, the oil, how dare you sell your oil? He set some of the oil fields on fire, and those aren't going to go out anytime soon. They won't go out until the oil is depleted. So he wasn't there specifically for the oil. He was probably there more for the coastline. Some of the oil, mostly the coastline. Okay, now because it was one of our allies that was attacked, the United States took the offensive. That means we had to fight on the side of Kuwait. So that was Operation Desert Storm. UN, or the United Nations forces, they were the ones that really started the whole thing. But because the United States is so attached to the UN, it was mostly our forces that went out and fought in Operation Desert Storm. So we had 500,000 U.S. forces in that attack. So they took the offensive and began round-the-clock bombing of Iraqi troop positions. Now, that can be tricky, especially in the Middle East, where oftentimes they will disguise a military operation within a neighborhood of civilians. And so the United States was always being kind of accused of bullying people throughout the rest of the world for dropping bombs on the civilian population, when it was the people who were putting military in a civilian population that were really the ones to blame. If you don't want your citizens hurt, you don't make them targets. It's kind of that thing. But the United States had been working on new technology. Remember, we talked about that with the 80s, and now we're in the 90s, and this new technology is really becoming a huge part of the military industrial complex. So this new technology included highly accurate smart bombs. You have a smartphone, these were smart bombs. And cruise missiles, they enabled the Air Force to select and destroy military targets without harming the civilian population of Iraq, which is not easy to do considering they would kind of hide one within the other. So they would find specifically the military target that was surrounded by civilian targets or civilian camouflage, and they would pinpoint that military target and bomb it only. So Bush insisted that the war in the Persian Gulf be directed by military men rather than by politicians. Brilliant idea. That's kind of what we should have been doing all along when it came to our history of warfare. His idea that this should be directed by the military was absolutely spot on, correct. Okay, now where did he come up with that idea? Remember, he had once been the head of the CIA. He understood that there were people who had specific talents that needed to be used in specific places, and that when politicians who didn't understand what was going on got involved, they caused a huge mess. If we want to go back in just a military history and look at where that caused a huge mess, remember Korea, when the President of the United States didn't understand the importance of taking out the supply lines from China to North Korea. And the president said, I don't want you to harm those supply lines. I don't want you to go into China and get rid of those supply lines. No, 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 no. And MacArthur said, well, if we don't take out those supply lines, then we're just going to keep getting shot up. We need to win this war. And he disobeyed the president. He cut those supply lines, and then had to be extracted and was immediately fired for disobeying the president. And it turns out that the president's whole philosophy for that war was not to win. It was to contain communism, not to win the war. And that's when MacArthur was famous for saying, you cannot win a war that you don't intend to win. You will not succeed in a war you don't intend to win. So Bush was intent on winning this war, and so he put the military men in charge of it. Now, the goal of this war, was pretty much the same. It was because Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, he must be removed from Kuwait. That became the primary directive here. The United States was not interested in going into Iraq and dethroning or removing Saddam Hussein from office. They just wanted him to leave, very specifically wanted him to leave Kuwait. So that is going to be the thrust of this military exercise. Now, the two men that you see here are General Powell and General Schwarzkopf. General Powell is going to remain in Washington, and he's going to direct things from there. He's going to be the liaison between the soldiers on the field, the president, and the press. He's going to be the terminus for all three of those. And then you have Schwarzkopf, who's going to lead the action on the ground in Iraq. And he's going to have contact with Powell, and the two of them are going to work things out together. These two worked really well together, and they did a bang-up job. Just fantastic job. So General Colin Powell, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That means all of the heads of all of the military. He was in charge of all of them, working with them, helping them to coordinate their different moves. And he was also the one who was in front of the cameras the majority of the time, speaking to the press. So there it is. He became the spokesman for the military. And for the first time since World War II, Congress followed the counsel of a military commander because he knows what he's doing and Congress does not. When it comes to military and warfare, the Congress has no clue. None. Can you imagine some of the Congress people we have today trying to run a war in another country? Most of them cannot help the governments in their own states. I mean, we have issues in our state where our Congress people, our senators and our representatives are so busy trying to get things for themselves and for their friends that they have totally ignored the state of California, unfortunately. Unfortunately, Nancy Pelosi, who is the current Speaker of the House, is from California, and she has blocked several efforts for small businesses to get help during this time. It's almost like she doesn't care about the people that she's supposed to be representing. And there is a way for the people she's representing to fire her, and that's in the election booth. They can just vote her out, and that's a possibility, because she is not really capable of, helping in this instance. Just imagine people who have never been to war, have never had any kind of military training, being asked to run a military campaign. It would be miserable. So it's a good thing we had military leadership for this. General Norman Schwarzkopf is appointed to lead the troops into combat. He kept the American public and the world aware of daily events and the war through television briefings. So both of these men were in the public eye, and they would very specifically say, okay, this is what has happened so far. Now, this is where it starts getting a little tricky. Hang on, okay. It gets a little tricky because our press, this is the time when CNN really, really, really made it big, was during this Persian Gulf War. They had been around, and almost everybody watched CNN, the cable news network. Anyone with cable anyway. But this is when people started looking at them and going, Okay. They made it big. They ran 24/7 with coverage of Operation Desert Storm. But it also became kind of I hate to say a joke, but it almost became a joke. It became really silly, some of these press conferences, because the reporters didn't seem to have the sense of what kinds of questions they should ask or shouldn't ask. And they acted like, you need to give me all the information or you're trying to hide something. Well, you have to remember, this is a war. So the hiding issue was not so much about, we don't want to give people full information. It was more along the lines of, we have troops who are fighting. We don't want to give the enemy information through these press conferences. And it got to the point where people were just looking at the media of the United States and saying, what is wrong with you? I mean, it became like that. So I'm going to give you guys a little assignment. If we were in the classroom right now, I would be pulling this up right now. We'd be watching it together and you'd be laughing. But I can't do that right now on YouTube because, it's copyrighted. So I'm going to tell you what to look up because it's worth watching. Look up Saturday Night Live. Okay. And I'm not going to recommend that very often, but look up Saturday Night Live and look for, Operation Desert Storm briefings. Okay. Just write that, or Operation Desert Storm press conference, and it will come up. It's really funny because basically what they did is they just parodied the reporters who had asked questions that should not have been asked in a public forum to the military personnel when we have men at war. So some of the questions they would ask would be, and this is real reporters would ask these kinds of questions. Where are you planning to send the troops next? And the people who were running the press conference would say, we're not going to answer that. That would put our troops in danger. What is your next target? We're not going to answer that because that would give our troop position away to the enemy. Oh. So when do you think we're going to be wrapping all this up? They would ask questions that would just put people in danger, and the military personnel would have to repeat over and over again to the press, we can't answer those questions because they could put people in danger. Stop asking us like where they're going to be and what weapons we're going to use and what time we're going to be attacking. We can't answer those questions. And so Saturday Night Live did a really great parody, and you will recognize a lot of people in that parody because a lot of people who weren't famous at the time but became famous are in that. So I hope you really enjoy it. It's very, very funny. Okay. So the main goal for Schwarzkopf was to minimize risk and save soldiers. He used that smart weapons technology He was very, very careful about how he moved his troops. He wanted to keep them as safe as possible while still winning the war, because that is the whole goal here. So patriotism and national unity in America reached an all-time high since World War II because people were all watching it together. So that was fascinating. We got to see how war plays out from our living rooms. Okay, so the war only lasted 2.5 months. It was the shortest war our nation has ever fought, and the reason for that was because we had military personnel actually running it and not the political machine in Washington. This was what really makes the difference. When military personnel run the war, there is fewer lives lost and there is faster resolution. Okay, President Bush did not pursue Saddam Hussein into Baghdad because that was not the primary objective of Operation Desert Storm. The liberation of Kuwait was the primary objective, and that had been achieved. It's that simple. He followed the objective. He got it done. Now, some people are going to look at this and say, do we trust this guy? We kicked him out of Kuwait, but what else is he going to get into? But you can't attack somebody for something they might do. That's kind of the philosophy there, unless there is a credible threat. And at the time, he had just lost the war. People didn't think of this as a credible threat. Okay. Other news, Clarence Thomas was nominated by Bush to the Supreme Court to replace the retiring Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the first Black American on the Supreme Court, and Clarence Thomas, obviously Black, is going to be replacing him. He had the skills, he had the background, he had the credibility to be in this position. The president got his name, interviewed him, said, "This is the man I want." The big problem was going to be that this man was a conservative, and the liberals in Congress and in the media didn't like the idea of having a conservative Supreme Court justice. They wanted to have a liberal Supreme Court justice. The ultimate goal, obviously, with the Supreme Court is to have some liberal and some conservative so they can balance each other out, and so they can debate and discuss and come up with the best solution for everybody. But they were really upset about a conservative president putting a conservative on the Supreme Court, and so they went after him, and a woman came forward and said that he had sexually harassed her in the workplace. So let's talk about the good parts of Clarence Thomas. I'm sorry that my face, my little thing here kind of covers part of it. Let me see if I can. See, I just don't want to mess with it because I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up bad. So I'll repeat those little things for you. So some great examples of American achievement because of Clarence Thomas. He was born to poor sharecroppers in the hills of Georgia. Sharecropping is not an easy gig. That means that somebody else owns the land, you rent it, you plant crops, and then when you harvest your crop, a majority of that crop actually goes to the person who owns the land, and you get the rest of it. It's very hard to make a living doing that. I grew up in a house where my mom was a sharecropper during her childhood and early teen years, and she has nothing good to say about sharecropping because her family lived pretty much in poverty the whole time. They worked like dogs every day, all day, and didn't have anything to show for it. And as a result, her father had to work multiple jobs to bring money in for the family, and he died in his early 50s as a result of overwork, stress, you name it, he had it. And when he died, her mom had to leave the property because there wasn't anybody to actually continue on with the sharecropping. So she has nothing really good to say about this system of farming. Okay, but let's look at, he's born to poor sharecroppers, but he's not going to stay there. Through his own hard work and God-given ability, he earned a law degree. Okay, so that means he studied in school, he studied on his own, and he earned his right to go to college. He went to college, did well, and then went on to law school. That takes a lot of effort. So it's just one sentence, but man, there's a lot in that sentence that you can unpack and say, this guy worked really hard to get that law degree. He achieved several important government positions, including Assistant Attorney General from Missouri. So he became the Attorney General is really like the highest ranking lawyer in a government position. So if he was Assistant Attorney General from Missouri, the Attorney General would be the top lawyer in Missouri. He was the man's assistant. And he became judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. So he had credibility and he had the experience. Okay, I said I was going to repeat that. Missouri is covered, so write in Missouri. If you just want to put MO for short for Missouri, go for it. And then we're missing the word for after appeals, and that's the only thing I'm blocking. So write that down. Okay. When confirmed a justice of the Supreme Court, Thomas said, that means after he went through his confirmation hearings with the Senate, he said this: I'd like to thank America. I'd like to thank the country for the things it stands for and the people for the things we stand for, our ideals. I give God thanks for our being able to stand here today, and I give God thanks for our ability to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel loved. So many liberals opposed the appointment of Thomas specifically because he was a conservative. They did not want a conservative on the Supreme Court. So during his Senate confirmation hearings, those were marred with a charge of sexual harassment brought by a law professor named Anita Hill. And she still to this day stands by her testimony that he said things that were inappropriate to her, that he made passes at her, that it was really just making the work environment a little uncomfortable for her, which, I mean, that's a legit complaint if it happened. And I'm not saying it didn't. I'm not saying it did. I honestly don't know. I wasn't there, but the majority of people in the Senate said we are still going to go with Clarence Thomas because we believe him over her. Now, Anita Hill to this day still says, yes, it did happen. But this is a very, very, very common technique that is used in politics. When someone is up for a job, they will trot out people who say, this person offended me, this person did something that was really wrong, and they don't deserve this position of power. This is all about accountability, and that is important. Okay, so should she have gone before a Senate and testified? Yes, she should have, because it was up to the Senate to hear both sides of the story and come up with a legitimate reason to confirm or deny his appointment to the Supreme Court. They confirmed. Okay. But this still goes on today. Right now, our former Vice President Joe Biden, who is actually running for president right now, is being accused of sexual harassment in the workplace. And this happens quite a lot, unfortunately, not just in Washington. Washington is kind of a fishbowl. Everybody knows everybody. And so when it happens there, it's like it's known everywhere. Everybody knows about it. But unfortunately, this kind of thing happens in every business and all over the United States, all over the world. So that's why I am constantly encouraging students to pay attention to their surroundings and to pay attention to the people in their lives. No one should ever do or say anything that makes you feel uncomfortable when it comes to sex. Okay, if someone is touching you and it makes you feel uncomfortable, you need to say, don't touch me. And then you need to tell your parents. Or if it's to the point where you feel like you are being threatened, you call the police immediately. That's your first step, is to call the police. If anybody says or does anything that makes you feel like you are being threatened, you need to call the police, period. Okay. So it is important that she testified, but there was enough or a lack of evidence that what she was saying happened. Okay. In Africa, there was a civil war in Somalia, and it caused widespread starvation among the people of the land because if you are constantly fighting, nobody has time to plant. Typically, women planted the fields in a lot of African countries, but when women were threatened, because women were being threatened, then they couldn't plant either. So Congress is going to send troops to end the fighting and feed the people, and they're going to be doing this through the United Nations. What ended up happening was the Somali warlords, the people who are trying to take over and make the country theirs, they resented the presence of U.S. forces, and they're going to fight against them, when really the primary reason for the United States being there was to stop the fighting, get these people together to talk, and to feed the people who were really looking for some peace in their homeland. This is not a pleasant war. This was really, really disgusting. Women were being attacked anytime they were found alone. Sometimes they're kidnapped out of their houses. Children in schools were beheaded at their desks. Those are not threatening people, but it terrorized those around Somalia so that they would not fight back. They were so scared of being killed. Okay. Congress continued to spend, driving the national debt to $4 trillion by 1992. By this time, the Congress was primarily Democratic, and they were putting a lot of debt onto that clock, but blaming the Republican leadership in the executive office. So this national debt increase kept going up and up and up. Okay, now thinking the collapse of the Soviet Union signaled a new world order for world peace, President Bush cut the defense budget. That was a mistake. Okay, this did very little to help the national debt, but that's what the liberals in Congress were saying. The reason we have a national debt as big as we have it is because of the military buildup during Reagan, and they still teach that today. So this idea was that if we cut the defense budget, then we will get out of national debt. But it didn't help. In fact, when he cut the bases, all the people who worked on the base or the people who lived around a base, especially in the United States, they were now out of work. Whole towns went under because they depended on the military base to help support them. The restaurants invited soldiers to come in and eat. The stores, that's where soldiers shopped and did, bought Christmas gifts and, shaving cream and deodorant. I mean, those were really important parts of our American culture. Having a military base and then the town around it was helping to support that base, and the base was helping to support them. So as a result, many people were thrown out of work, whole towns went under, and this didn't help at all. Now, what happens when a person gets thrown out of work? They have to go to the government and ask for help for food stamps and help with their loans. They borrow money, and as a result, they just get more and more in debt, and the government gets more and more in debt. Okay, savings and loan scandals also cost the taxpayers $500 billion when careless speculation, that means you're putting a little bit of money down on multiple houses usually, and then hoping you can sell the house for a profit and get all your money back. Okay, so you say, I'm going to buy a $300,000 house, but I only have $10,000 to put down. So I'm going to put that $10,000 down. I've got this $300,000 house. I'm going to fix it up a little bit. I'm going to raise the price to $500,000. I'll sell it, and then I can pay the bank back $300,000, and I pocket $200,000. That's the thought process with speculation. But when a lot of people do that, it ends up shorting that market, and it ends up where you don't have enough buyers for all that debt. And so you're stuck with a house that's very expensive that you can't sell because nobody's buying. So it can cause a big problem. So there was some careless speculation, and there was also some illegal accounting procedures for a number of bank failures. Banks were cheating people, and they needed to be called up on that and, basically pulled it by the collar and said, knock it off. So President Bush finally agreed to raise taxes in order to keep the government from going further into debt, because that debt clock was just running and running and running. He's like, okay, I've tried to cut defense budget, and that just caused more debt. The housing shortage is causing more debt. Congress continued, however, to increase government spending because all these people were out of work. They said now they need extra help. We have to have an emergency fund. We have to have emergency money going out. So we need to raise more money to send it out to the people who wouldn't have lost their jobs in the first place if we hadn't just cut what we cut. Okay. Now, President Bush was elected on the promise, I will not raise taxes. In fact, he is famous for saying multiple times, I will have no new taxes. And then finally, somebody asked him about that. Are you sure you can't be a president without raising taxes? And he said, read my lips, no new taxes. And that became like the catchphrase for him. And so, of course, third year in, he raises taxes and everybody goes, okay, so you lied. Now, a lot of times a presidential candidate will make a promise they cannot fulfill, but he was so adamant about this and it became such a huge part of his campaign that when he raised taxes, nobody believed him anymore. He just lost all credibility. Okay, I'm going to do one more and then we're going to wrap it up for today. So Bush, because he had only served 4 years, that's one term. He is going to seek re-election. That's another 4 years. That's 2 terms, and that's as many as a president can hold office. They can hold office for 2 terms, 4 years apiece, or 10 years total. So you could be a vice president who becomes president like 2 years before the previous president. Like, for instance, if the president is either killed or dies in office or resigns, you can finish his term and then you can have 2 more re-elections as long as you don't go over 10 years. Okay? So Bush sought re-election in 1992. His platform was traditional values, which that's all about, families, encouraging families to really run their homes the way they see fit, traditional values in schools. He also went with free enterprise, which allows people to decide what to sell and how to create stuff, having the freedom to do that, to work, patriotism, love of country, and a strong military defense. He had cut the military spending, put a lot of people out of work, and now he's like, okay, maybe I should go back on that and start rebuilding the military defense again. And he also promised to lower taxes if reelected. But by this time, even though he had accomplished so many great things during his presidency, that increasing national debt is going to be the thing that keeps him from getting reelected. Yep, that's right. Spoiler alert, he doesn't win. But we'll talk about that some more tomorrow. And I hope you have a really good night. Do a little bit of homework every day so you don't get too avalanched underneath all of that homework. I don't want you to be doing homework at the last minute trying to get it all in. Don't forget, you don't have to send me your homework through email anymore if you're planning to just turn your book in at the end. Okay? It would be easier for me if you turned your book in, because then I can grade multiple books at one time instead of one at a time through email. So I will talk to you guys tomorrow and we'll finish this lecture.